Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into the boots of an Italian partisan fighter scrambling through the jagged peaks of the Alps during World War II. Picture yourself crouched behind a boulder at 6,000 feet, your breath forming small clouds in the thin mountain air as you watch German soldiers march along the valley road below. Your stomach growls. You haven't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and that proper meal was basically some stale bread and whatever berries you could forage. The reality, you've got maybe a 30% chance of seeing the end of this war, and that is if you are really good at not getting shot, captured, or frozen to death. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I invite you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you are tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. It is always warming to know how vast our community of nocturnal historians reaches. It is September 1943, and everything you thought you knew about your country has just exploded. 3 days ago, you were Giovanni Rossi, a 22-year-old factory worker from Turin, worrying about whether Maria from the bakery might actually say yes if you asked her to the cinema. Then Marshal Badoglio announced Italy's surrender to the Allies on the 8th of September. And suddenly, your world turned upside down faster than a tourist trying to navigate Roman traffic. The Germans, who had been your supposed allies just yesterday, are now treating Italy like their personal vacation home. Except they're the kind of house guests who eat all your food, steal your furniture, and occasionally shoot the neighbors. German troops are pouring over the Brenner Pass, and they're not here for the gelato. They're establishing the Italian Social Republic under Mussolini, who, in perhaps history's most awkward comeback tour, has been rescued by German paratroopers from his mountain prison. You are faced with 3 choices, none of them particularly appealing. You can join Mussolini's new fascist army and fight for the Germans, which feels about as appetizing as weak, old fish. You can try to blend into civilian life and hope nobody notices you are of military age. Good luck with that when every German checkpoint is looking for exactly guys like you. Or you can do what thousands of other young Italian men are doing right now. Grab whatever weapons you can find and head for the mountains. The decision crystallizes when you see German soldiers rounding up Italian army officers in your neighborhood. These aren't just any officers. Some of them taught you how to march back in basic training. Now they're being loaded onto trucks like cattle. And everyone knows where trucks full of prisoners go in this war. A chill runs down your spine that has nothing to do with the autumn air. Your choice becomes brutally simple: resist or collaborate. There is no middle ground when jackbooted soldiers are patrolling your streets, and your former government is now essentially a German puppet show. You think about your little sister, about the old man who runs the corner cafe and always slipped you an extra sugar cube, about the very idea that foreigners are now deciding who lives and dies in your homeland. So you make the choice that will define the rest of your life, however long that might be. You are going to join the partisans. The word partisan itself comes from the Italian partigiano, meaning someone who takes part or sides with a particular cause. But you are not thinking about etymology right now. You are thinking about survival, about resistance, and about how you are going to explain to your mother that her eldest son is about to disappear into the mountains to play hide and seek with the German army, except the stakes are life and death, and there is no home base to run to. You pack light, a change of clothes, your father's old hunting knife, what little food you can carry, and a photograph of Maria that you are not entirely sure why you are bringing. Maybe it is hope. Maybe it is just stupidity. Historians still debate whether the early partisan recruits were motivated more by patriotism or desperation. But honestly, when you are staring down the barrel of fascist occupation, the distinction becomes pretty academic. As you slip out of Turin under cover of darkness, heading toward the foothills of the Alps, you have no idea that you are joining what will become one of the largest and most effective resistance movements in occupied Europe. You don't know that within months there will be over 100,000 partisans fighting across Italy. Right now, you just know that the mountains ahead represent something the city no longer can: the possibility of freedom. The Alps loom before you, ancient and indifferent, their peaks still capped with early snow, even though it is only September. These mountains have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, Roman legions, medieval knights, Napoleon's armies. Now they're about to hide another generation of fighters, and you are walking straight into their embrace, trading the familiar streets of your hometown for a landscape that couldn't care less whether you live or die. Your first night in the mountains teaches you that everything you thought you knew about being cold was laughably naive. You are huddled in what used to be a shepherd's hut about 2,000 feet up the valley, and the wind is cutting through the stone walls like they're made of tissue paper. The temperature has dropped at least 20 degrees since you left the city, and you are starting to understand why mountain people have that particular brand of quiet toughness. They're too busy not freezing to death to waste energy on small talk. The partisan band you've stumbled into consists of 12 other men, ranging from your age to a grizzled former Alpine soldier named Roberto, who must be pushing 50. Roberto has the kind of weathered face that suggests he has been personally insulted by every mountain in northern Italy, and he has appointed himself your unofficial survival instructor. His first lesson is brutally simple. The cold will kill you faster than the Germans, so pay attention. You learn this the hard way when you wake up on your second morning to discover that your boots have frozen solid. Not just cold, actually frozen. Like someone replaced your leather footwear with blocks of ice shaped like shoes. Roberto finds this hilarious, which is easy for him since his feet aren't currently experiencing what you can only describe as Arctic betrayal. "City boy," he chuckles, showing you how to wrap your boots in your jacket at night to keep them from becoming foot-shaped icicles. The hideout itself is a masterclass in medieval discomfort. These shepherd huts were built for men who apparently had very different opinions about luxury than you do. The walls are thick stone, which is great for stopping bullets but terrible for insulation. There is no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters that let in precisely the right amount of wind to keep things interesting. The floor is packed earth, covered with whatever dry grass and leaves you can scavenge, creating a sleeping surface that makes your old factory dormitory bed seem like something from a palace. But here is the thing that surprises you. The camaraderie develops faster than frostbite. When you are all equally miserable, equally cold, and equally likely to die, social barriers tend to evaporate. Marco, a former university student from Milan, shares his last piece of chocolate with you on your third day. Giuseppe, a farmer's son who has never been more than 50 kilometers from his village, teaches you how to identify edible plants. These aren't just survival tactics, they're the building blocks of brotherhood forged in shared suffering. The daily routine, such as it is, revolves around not being discovered. You move the camp every few days, rotating between a network of caves, abandoned buildings, and natural shelters that previous generations of smugglers, bandits, and refugees have been using for centuries. The Alps have always been a place where inconvenient people disappear, and now you are just the latest in a long tradition of mountaineers with something to hide. Food is an ongoing adventure in creative desperation. You are learning to appreciate culinary experiences you never imagined. Like pine needle tea, surprisingly vitamin-rich, according to Roberto, roasted chestnuts when you can find them, and what can only be described as mystery soup, made from whatever vegetables the local farmers can secretly spare. Your mother would be horrified at your diet, but then again, your mother never had to maintain fighting strength while hiding from German patrols. The psychological adjustment is almost harder than the physical one 3 weeks ago. You had a schedule, a paycheck, and the comforting illusion that tomorrow would be basically like today. Now you measure time not in hours, but in heartbeats when you hear vehicles on the road below. Every sound could be salvation or death, and your nervous system is still calibrating to this new reality. Historians still debate whether the early partisan groups were effective military units or just bands of desperate fugitives. But from your perspective, the distinction is academic. You are learning to think tactically, where to place sentries, how to approach a position without being seen, why you never ever light a fire during the day when the smoke might be visible from the valley. These aren't skills they taught you in factory training. The hierarchy in your group is refreshingly simple. Roberto knows the mountains. So Roberto makes decisions about survival. Carlo, a former army sergeant, knows weapons, so Carlo makes decisions about fighting. Everyone else knows how to follow orders and try not to die, which frankly feels like a full-time job. Democracy is a luxury for people who aren't being hunted. Sleep becomes a precious commodity that you learn to steal in short bursts. Someone's always on watch, and the watch schedule rotates with the kind of precision usually reserved for Swiss timepieces. You discover you can actually fall asleep sitting up against a rock wall, which is either a useful survival skill or a sign that your standards have dropped considerably. By the end of your first week, you've lost about 10 pounds and gained what feels like 10 years of life experience. Your hands are cut from climbing, your feet are blistered from walking in wet boots, and you've had more conversations with Giuseppe about the philosophical implications of eating bark than you ever thought possible. But you are alive, you are free, and when you look down at the valley where German trucks still patrol the roads, you feel something you haven't felt since the 8th of September, hope. Your first lesson in partisan warfare comes courtesy of a British agent who drops out of the sky like some kind of khaki-clad fairy godmother. If fairy godmothers specialized in teaching people how to blow things up, Captain Williams, as he introduces himself with the kind of posh accent that makes you suspect he learned Italian from a textbook, has been parachuted in with enough explosives to redecorate half the valley. He is also carrying what appears to be a suitcase full of the most fascinating and terrifying toys you've ever seen. Right then, Williams says, unpacking his arsenal with the casual efficiency of a traveling salesman, who here knows the difference between plastic explosive and modeling clay. The uncomfortable silence that follows suggests that your group's demolition expertise extends roughly as far as accidentally breaking your mother's good china. Williams nods knowingly. Brilliant. We'll start with the basics then. The basics, it turns out, involve learning that modern warfare has become surprisingly artistic. Williams shows you how to shape plastic explosive charges with the same attention to detail that sculptors use on marble statues. Except your masterpieces are designed to turn railway bridges into abstract art installations. He demonstrates the principles of structural engineering by explaining exactly where to place charges to make a German supply train experience what he delicately calls sudden deceleration. Roberto, your mountain guide turned demolition student, proves surprisingly adept at this new curriculum. He has an intuitive understanding of how things are built, which translates beautifully to understanding how to unbuild them efficiently. It is like hunting, he explains, carefully molding plastique around a practice railway spike. You need to know where the animal is weak. Historians still debate whether partisan sabotage was more art than science. But watching Roberto work, you suspect it might be both. The weapons training is equally revelatory. Your group's current armament consists of whatever you manage to grab during your hasty departure from civilization. A few hunting rifles, one ancient revolver that might have seen action in the previous war, and Giuseppe's grandfather's shotgun, which appears to be held together by prayer and rust. Williams takes one look at this collection and makes a face like he has been served wine that turned to vinegar some time during the Renaissance. Not to worry, he says, producing a series of items that look like they were designed by someone who read too many adventure novels. There are Sten guns that can be assembled from parts dropped in separate packages, ammunition that has been packed with the precision of fine jewelry, and grenades that come with instruction manuals written in multiple languages. The British, you discover, have turned resistance support into a peculiar form of mail order catalogue service. Learning to handle these weapons properly requires unlearning almost everything you thought you knew about fighting. Factory work taught you precision and repetition. Partisan warfare teaches you adaptation and improvisation. You practice with the Sten gun until you can field. Strip it blindfolded. A useful skill when you are hiding in a cave with no light and German patrols are searching the area. The gun itself is famously unreliable, earning the nickname Plumber's Nightmare for its tendency to jam at inconvenient moments. But it is still infinitely better than Giuseppe's ancestral shotgun. Williams introduces you to the concept of guerrilla tactics with the enthusiasm of a university professor, explaining his favorite theorem. The key, he lectures while demonstrating how to set up an ambush, is to hit hard, hit fast, and disappear before Jerry knows what has happened. The mathematics of this approach are elegant. 12 men with surprise can defeat 50 men without it, provided those 12 men know the terrain and have somewhere to run. You learn about timing delays for explosives, how long you have between lighting a fuse and experiencing what Williams euphemistically calls the loud bit. You practice reading maps by moonlight, because daylight map reading tends to attract the wrong kind of attention. Most importantly, you learn about patience, how to lie motionless in wet grass for 6 hours waiting for the right moment to strike, and how to resist the urge to scratch the itch on your nose when a German sentry is standing 10 meters away. The psychological aspect of this training proves as challenging as the technical components. Williams explains that successful partisans think differently from regular soldiers. You are not trying to capture territory, he says, sketching diagrams in the dirt with a stick. You are trying to make the enemy's life complicated, expensive, and thoroughly unpleasant. It is warfare as extended practical joke, except the punchline involves explosions and the audience shoots back. Combat medicine becomes another essential skill, taught by Williams with the same matter of fact professionalism he brings to explosives instruction. You learn to identify the difference between wounds that require immediate attention and wounds that just require creative bandaging. More importantly, you learn how to keep fighting when you are scared, cold, hungry, and convinced that everyone is trying to kill you, because frankly, they are. By the end of 2 weeks of intensive training, your ragtag band has transformed into something resembling an actual military unit. You can set charges that will derail trains without killing innocent passengers, execute ambushes that maximize enemy casualties while minimizing your own exposure, and most crucially, vanish into the landscape like ghosts whenever the situation requires tactical disappearing. Williams nods approvingly at your progress, though he maintains that distinctly British talent for praising you, while simultaneously suggesting you'll probably die anyway. Your stomach has become a reliable timepiece, growling with clockwork precision every 3 hours, to remind you that partisan fighters apparently don't qualify for regular meal schedules. It has been 2 months since you joined the resistance, and you've discovered that hunger is a constant companion, not the dramatic fainting in the streets kind of hunger you see in movies, but a persistent gnawing awareness that food is always the most important thing you are not currently doing. The daily routine of staying alive while hiding from people who want to kill you has developed its own peculiar rhythm. You wake before dawn, not because you are naturally an early riser, but because dawn is when German patrols like to surprise mountain hideouts with the kind of wake-up call that involves bullets. The first hour of daylight is spent in absolute silence, listening for the sounds that don't belong. Truck engines laboring up mountain roads, the metallic click of weapons being checked, or the particular cadence of German voices carried on the wind. Breakfast, when it exists, is whatever you managed to forage the previous evening mixed with whatever the local farmers can secretly spare. You've become surprisingly fond of roasted acorns, which taste exactly like you'd expect tree nuts to taste. Earthy, bitter, and nothing like the chestnuts your grandmother used to buy from street vendors. Marco has become the group's unofficial forager, possessing an encyclopedic knowledge of which mountain plants won't kill you, and which ones merely taste like they might. The problem with living off the land is that the land wasn't particularly well stocked to begin with, and now you are sharing its resources with every other desperate soul in the mountains. Wild game is scarce because everyone with a rifle has been hunting everything that moves. Edible plants are becoming harder to find because other partisan groups have been harvesting them systematically. It is like trying to shop at a grocery store where the shelves are never restocked, and the other customers are also armed and starving. Your relationship with the local civilian population has become a delicate dance of mutual dependence and mutual suspicion. The farmers in the valley need you to succeed, because German occupation makes their lives miserable. But they also need to avoid being caught helping you, because the penalties for assisting partisans tend to be fatal and applied to entire families. This creates a complex ecosystem of carefully orchestrated support involving coded messages, midnight food drops, and an elaborate system of signals that would impress a professional spy network. Giuseppe has emerged as your primary liaison with the civilians, partly because he is from a farming family and understands their concerns, and partly because he has a talent for looking harmless, even when he is carrying enough explosives to redecorate a railway station. He returns from these covert negotiations with stories that highlight the impossible choices ordinary people face during wartime: help the resistance and risk execution, or stay neutral and watch your country remain enslaved. The physical demands of mountain living have transformed your body in ways that would probably impress your old factory supervisors if they weren't currently dealing with German labor requirements. Your legs have developed the kind of muscular endurance that comes from scrambling up rocky slopes while carrying weapons and supplies. Your hands have become a roadmap of cuts, scrapes, and calluses that tell the story of every cave you've sheltered in and every tree you've climbed for reconnaissance. But it is the psychological adaptation that surprises you most. 6 months ago, the sound of aircraft engines overhead meant nothing more interesting than wondering if the mail would be delayed. Now you can identify German reconnaissance planes by their engine noise and estimate their altitude, flight path, and likelihood of spotting your position. Your hearing has become hyperacute to the point where you can distinguish between the footsteps of your own sentries and the approach of potential threats. Sleep remains a luxury that you've learned to appreciate in 15-minute increments. The human body, you've discovered, can adapt to almost any schedule if the alternative is death. You've mastered the art of falling asleep instantly when the opportunity arises and waking equally quickly when circumstances require immediate attention. Roberto claims this is a skill that will serve you well in peacetime, though you are not entirely sure how explaining your ability to nap standing up will improve your employment prospects. The winter clothing situation has become an ongoing exercise in creative layering. You are wearing your original shirt, a sweater liberated from an abandoned house, a jacket that Giuseppe's cousin secretly provided, and a German army coat that fell off a supply truck during a recent ambush. The result looks like what might happen if several different armies got into a fight inside a clothing store, but it keeps you warm enough to maintain basic motor functions. Historians still debate whether the harsh living conditions strengthened or weakened partisan effectiveness, but from your perspective, the question seems academic. Discomfort has become so normal that you've stopped thinking of it as temporary hardship and started treating it as the baseline condition of existence. When you occasionally remember your old life, regular meals, dry socks, sleeping indoors, it feels like recalling someone else's dream. Your personal hygiene has evolved into whatever you can manage with cold mountain streams and soap made from animal fat that smells exactly as appetizing as it sounds. You've learned to appreciate the simple pleasure of clean water and discovered that being truly clean is less important than being warm, dry, and not riddled with bullet holes. The most surprising aspect of this daily survival routine is how quickly it becomes routine. 3 months ago, you worried about being late for work. Now you worry about whether that unusual bird call might actually be a German signal. Your priorities have simplified to an almost philosophical purity. Stay alive, help your comrades stay alive, and make the enemy's day considerably worse whenever possible. Your education in clandestine communications begins when a teenage girl appears at your mountain hideout carrying what looks like an innocent basket of apples, but turns out to contain more secrets than a Vatican archive. Maria, not the Maria from the bakery you left behind, but a 17-year-old courier whose baby face disguises nerves of steel, delivers messages with the casual efficiency of a postal worker, except her mail route involves dodging German checkpoints, and her delivery delays can result in people getting shot. The Partisan communication network you discover operates with the complexity of a Swiss watch designed by paranoid geniuses. Every message is coded using systems that range from brilliantly simple to absurdly complicated. Your group's favorite method involves using innocuous-sounding conversations about livestock and weather that actually contain detailed intelligence about German troop movements. When Giuseppe mentions that his cousin's chickens are laying more eggs than usual, he is actually reporting that the German garrison in the valley has been reinforced by approximately 30 men. Learning these codes feels like studying a foreign language where making grammar mistakes can get you executed. You practice conversations where discussing the price of milk actually means coordinating ambush timing, and complaints about sick cattle translate into warnings about increased enemy patrols. Roberto has become surprisingly fluent in this agricultural doublespeak, possibly because he spent enough time around actual farmers to make the cover story convincing. The written communication system involves even more elaborate precautions. Messages are written in invisible ink made from lemon juice, hidden inside the spines of books, or encoded using a system where every third letter spells out the real message. Williams taught you a particularly clever method where innocent-looking love letters contain tactical intelligence hidden in the romantic poetry, because apparently nothing says, "resist fascist occupation," like badly written sonnets about German supply schedules. Radio communication represents the crown jewel of partisan technology, provided you don't mind the constant risk of direction, finding equipment turning your transmission into a target for artillery strikes. The radio operator, a former telephone technician named Franco, treats the wireless set with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. He has memorized broadcasting schedules, frequency assignments, and coded call signs with the dedication of a seminary student, partly because forgetting any of these details could result in Allied bombers accidentally targeting your position instead of the German ammunition depot down the valley. The challenge of maintaining operational security while coordinating with multiple resistance cells has created a communication protocol that would impress professional cryptographers. Each cell knows only what it needs to know about other operations, creating a network where captured partisans can't betray information they never possessed. It is compartmentalization taken to an almost neurotic extreme. But when the alternative is having your entire resistance network rolled up by one talkative prisoner, neurotic starts looking like genius. Signal systems using mirrors, smoke, and strategically placed laundry have transformed the entire valley into a giant telegraph network. A white sheet hung in a particular way means German patrols are active in Sector 3. A small fire lit at precisely noon indicates that the planned sabotage operation should proceed as scheduled. Even the local church bells have been incorporated into the system. Different combinations of rings carry different meanings, turning Sunday services into coded military briefings. Your personal role in this communication web involves memorizing an ever-changing roster of contact procedures, recognition signals, and emergency protocols. You learn that approaching a safe house requires following a specific sequence. Knock 3 times. Wait, knock twice. Then identify yourself using this week's password, which changes according to a schedule that everyone somehow remembers, despite the complete absence of written records. Getting the sequence wrong doesn't just mean embarrassment. It means the people inside assume you are a German infiltrator and respond accordingly. Counter intelligence has become an obsession that borders on paranoia, because the Germans have become increasingly sophisticated about infiltrating resistance networks. Every new recruit undergoes scrutiny that would make a background investigator proud. Where did they come from? Who can vouch for them and do their stories? Check out under careful questioning. You've learned to spot the subtle inconsistencies that might indicate someone isn't who they claim to be. The wrong regional accent, unfamiliarity with local customs, or knowledge that is too precise about subjects they supposedly shouldn't know about. The psychological pressure of constant deception takes its toll in unexpected ways. You find yourself automatically speaking in code even during casual conversations, and you've developed the habit of never saying anything important in a straight line. This linguistic paranoia extends to thinking you catch yourself planning conversations 3 steps ahead, considering how every statement might be interpreted if overheard by the wrong people. Women like Maria form the backbone of the courier network, partly because they attract less suspicion at checkpoints, and partly because they've proven remarkably talented at the kind of quick thinking that turns potential disasters into minor inconveniences. When Maria was stopped by German soldiers while carrying forged identity papers, she convinced them she was rushing to her grandmother's deathbed, complete with tears that were probably genuine given the circumstances. The soldiers let her pass, unaware that grandmother's medicine was actually intelligence about planned German reinforcements. Historians still debate whether the partisan communication networks were more effective than conventional military intelligence systems. But from your perspective, effectiveness is measured by simpler criteria. Are your messages getting through? And are the people carrying them surviving to deliver the next one? The answer, remarkably, is usually yes to both questions, though the margin for error remains uncomfortably thin. The entire system depends on ordinary people making extraordinary choices about risk and trust. Every farmer who hides a message, every priest who provides sanctuary, every teenager who carries intelligence through enemy checkpoints represents a small act of rebellion that collectively forms an invisible army of civilian resistance. Your understanding of civilian-partisan relationships gets complicated the moment you realize that the baker who has been secretly supplying your group with bread is also selling information about German patrol schedules to 2 other resistance cells, and his brother-in-law is a fascist militia member who would shoot all of you without hesitation if he knew about the family bread business. Welcome to occupied Italy, where family dinners must be more tense than a hostage negotiation. The civilian population in your mountain valley exists in a state of carefully calibrated survival, balancing between the competing demands of German occupiers, fascist collaborators, and various partisan groups who all need food, shelter, and information. These aren't the clear moral choices you imagined when you first joined the resistance. They're a daily series of impossible calculations where helping the wrong people can get your entire family executed, but not helping anyone guarantees you'll remain enslaved forever. Anna, the widow who runs the small inn at the valley's main crossroads, has mastered this delicate dance with the skill of a professional diplomat. She serves meals to German officers, exchanges pleasantries with fascist officials, and somehow manages to provide your group with detailed intelligence about enemy movements, without anyone suspecting her loyalties lie anywhere other than with whoever's currently paying for dinner. Her ability to smile warmly while mentally cataloguing military information would impress a professional spy. The relationship between partisans and civilians operates on a complex system of unspoken agreements and carefully managed expectations. Civilians provide what support they can: food, shelter, information, medical supplies. But they also need to maintain plausible deniability if things go wrong. This creates a peculiar etiquette where everyone understands what is happening, but nobody ever says it directly. When old Pietro mentions that his sheep seem restless at night, he is actually warning you about increased German patrol activity. But if questioned later, he was genuinely just concerned about his livestock. Children represent both the greatest asset and the greatest vulnerability in this civilian resistance network. Kids can move through German checkpoints with an innocence that adults can't fake, carrying messages and small supplies, while appearing to be nothing more threatening than youngsters running errands. But children also haven't mastered the art of keeping secrets, which means that every piece of information they carry comes with the risk of innocent revelation at the worst possible moment. Father Giuseppe, not to be confused with Giuseppe, the farmer's son in your group, runs the local parish with the kind of moral flexibility that would have scandalized the Vatican, but proves invaluable for practical resistance work. His church serves as an unofficial message center, confessional booth, intelligence hub, and occasionally a temporary weapons cache. The man has somehow convinced himself that lying to fascists doesn't count as actual lying in the eyes of God, which is either inspired theology or creative rationalization, depending on your perspective. The economic relationships become equally complex as the war progresses. Civilians need goods that partisans can liberate from German supplies: medicine, warm clothing, tools. But they also need to avoid being caught with obviously stolen military equipment. This creates an elaborate bartering system where German blankets become mysteriously found items, and partisan raids on supply convoys somehow result in extra food appearing in civilian larders, without anyone asking uncomfortable questions about origins. Trust develops through small gestures and careful testing rather than grand declarations of solidarity. When Maria the innkeeper leaves an extra portion of soup near where you are hiding, she is not just being charitable, she is demonstrating that she is willing to take small risks on your behalf. When you respond by ensuring that German patrols never quite manage to catch her breaking curfew, you are showing that partisan protection extends to civilian allies. These incremental exchanges of risk and support gradually build the foundation of mutual dependence. The presence of collaborators adds a layer of paranoia that affects every civilian interaction. Some people genuinely support fascist ideology, but others collaborate out of fear, coercion, or simple survival instinct. The challenge for both partisans and resistance supporting civilians is identifying which category each person falls into, because guessing wrong can be fatal. This uncertainty creates an atmosphere where everyone watches everyone else for signs of betrayal, turning ordinary social interactions into continuous intelligence-gathering operations. Women often serve as the primary interface between partisan groups and civilian communities, partly because they're less likely to be suspected of military activity, and partly because they typically maintain the social networks that make clandestine support possible. The baker's wife coordinates food supplies, the doctor's daughter provides medical intelligence, and the teacher secretly distributes Allied propaganda while maintaining her official position. Their contribution to resistance operations is enormous, but it is also largely invisible to anyone who isn't paying careful attention. Generational differences create additional complications within civilian communities. Older residents who remember the previous war often approach resistance with caution born of experience. They know that occupying armies eventually leave, but revenge against collaborators can last for decades. Younger civilians, particularly teenagers, tend toward more dramatic gestures of support that sometimes help the resistance and sometimes create unnecessary risks for everyone involved. Historians still debate whether civilian support was essential to partisan effectiveness or simply a helpful bonus, but from your daily experience, the question seems absurd. Without civilian intelligence, you'd be operating blind. Without civilian food supplies, you'd starve. Without civilian shelter, you'd freeze. The resistance exists because ordinary people make extraordinary daily choices to support it, often at considerable personal risk, and always without guarantee that their sacrifices will ultimately matter. The psychological burden on these civilian supporters may actually exceed what partisan fighters experience. You chose to join the resistance and accept the risks that come with armed rebellion. Civilians find themselves drawn into a conflict they didn't choose, forced to make moral decisions that could affect their families for generations. Their courage is quieter than yours, but it is no less real and considerably more complicated. Your assumptions about women in wartime get permanently adjusted when Lucia arrives at your mountain camp carrying a British Sten gun like it is a purse, and demonstrating a working knowledge of explosive devices that puts most of your male comrades to shame. She is 19, has been fighting with partisan groups for 8 months, and possesses the kind of calm competence that suggests she is either naturally suited for warfare or has seen enough combat to develop professional indifference to getting shot at. The female partisans operating throughout the Italian Alps represent a complete departure from traditional gender roles, which is either inspiring progress or terrifying necessity, depending on your perspective. These aren't women playing at being soldiers. They're fighters who've earned their positions through the same brutal selection process that everyone else faces. Survive long enough to be useful, demonstrate competence under fire, and don't get your comrades killed through incompetence or cowardice. Lucia introduces you to a network of women operatives that extends far beyond what you'd imagined possible. There is Elena, a former nursing student who serves as the group's medic, while also maintaining detailed intelligence files on German officers. Teresa coordinates supply operations with the efficiency of a logistics expert, which makes sense, since she was studying economics before the war interrupted her education. And then there is Carla, whose specialty involves getting close enough to enemy installations to plant explosives, a job that requires equal parts technical skill and suicidal courage. The advantages that women bring to resistance operations become apparent almost immediately. They can move through German checkpoints with less scrutiny, partly because occupying soldiers don't expect women to be carrying weapons or intelligence, and partly because flirtation provides cover for activities that would seem suspicious coming from men. When Teresa needs to reconnoiter a German supply depot, she simply walks past it several times, while appearing to shop at nearby stores, gathering detailed information about guard rotations and security procedures, without attracting attention. Combat roles for women partisans have evolved organically based on effectiveness, rather than ideology. Lucia proves to be an exceptional sniper, partly due to natural shooting ability, and partly because her smaller size makes it easier to find concealed firing positions in rocky terrain. She is responsible for several successful ambushes, where German officers discovered too late that the seemingly innocent figure in the distance was actually a highly trained marksman with a clear shot and steady hands. The courier network relies heavily on women who can carry messages, money, and small weapons through territory that would be impossible for men to traverse safely. These aren't passive roles. Courier work requires quick thinking, improvisational skills, and the ability to talk your way out of situations that could turn deadly in seconds. When Elena was stopped while carrying forged identity documents, she convinced the German patrol that she was rushing to her cousin's wedding with a gift that absolutely could not be delayed, complete with fabricated details about family drama that made the soldiers eager to end the conversation. Medical responsibilities have naturally fallen largely to women with nursing or first aid training, but partisan medicine involves skills that weren't covered in peacetime medical education. Elena has learned to perform surgery by candlelight in cave hideouts, treat gunshot wounds with improvised supplies, and make life or death triage decisions while under enemy fire. Her medical bag contains standard supplies alongside items like morphine, obtained through black market connections, and surgical instruments that were borrowed from abandoned hospitals. The psychological dynamics of mixed-gender partisan units require constant navigation of social complexities that don't exist in traditional military organizations. Romantic relationships develop under circumstances that would strain any couple's shared danger, constant stress, uncertain survival prospects, but they also create operational security concerns when personal feelings might compromise tactical decisions. The unspoken rule seems to be that everyone can pursue whatever relationships they want, provided those relationships don't get anyone killed. Leadership among female partisans operates differently than the hierarchical structures typical in male-dominated groups. Women like Teresa tend to coordinate through consensus, building, and collaborative decision-making, which can be more time-consuming but often produces better informed choices. When planning operations, the female commanders consider factors that their male counterparts sometimes overlook: civilian safety, long-term community relations, and the psychological impact of resistance actions on local populations. The specialized skills that women bring to resistance operations extend beyond traditional gender roles into areas that surprise even experienced male partisans. Carla has demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how to blend explosives with architectural knowledge to maximize structural damage while minimizing civilian casualties. Her sabotage operations target German installations with surgical precision, causing maximum disruption to enemy operations while avoiding the kind of collateral damage that might turn local populations against the resistance. Intelligence gathering represents another area where female operatives excel, partly due to their ability to maintain social connections that provide access to information, and partly because they're often underestimated by enemy personnel. When German officers socialize at the local inn, they rarely consider that the waitress serving their drinks might be memorizing their conversations and noting details about unit strengths, morale problems, and planned operations. Training female recruits involves the same weapons instruction, tactical education, and survival skills that male partisans receive, but it also includes specialized preparation for the unique challenges women face in combat situations. Elena teaches new female fighters how to modify their clothing for better concealment of weapons and supplies, how to use apparent vulnerability as a tactical advantage, and how to maintain operational effectiveness while dealing with the additional physical demands that women face during extended field operations. Historians still debate whether female participation in the Italian resistance was primarily driven by ideological commitment or practical necessity, but from your daily experience, the question seems irrelevant. The women fighting alongside you are there for the same reasons you are, because fascist occupation is intolerable, because someone needs to resist, and because they possess the skills and courage necessary to make a difference. Their gender provides certain tactical advantages, but their value to the resistance comes from the same qualities that make any partisan effective: intelligence, dedication, and the ability to keep fighting when everything seems hopeless. Your first Alpine winter as a partisan teaches you that cold is not just a weather condition. It is a living enemy that wants to kill you just as efficiently as any German soldier. Except it never sleeps, never retreats, and shows absolutely no interest in Geneva Convention protections. The temperature has dropped to -15°C, which would be merely uncomfortable if you were spending the season in a heated house with regular meals, but becomes a daily survival challenge when your accommodation consists of caves, abandoned shepherd huts, and the occasional barn that sympathetic farmers pretend they don't know you are using. The winter of 1943-44 proves to be one of the harshest in recent memory, which is either cosmic irony or confirmation that the universe has a particularly dark sense of humor about timing. Your group has relocated to higher altitude caves that provide better concealment from German patrols, but also expose you to weather conditions that would challenge Arctic explorers. The wind cuts through the mountains with the persistence of a saw blade, and snow accumulates with the kind of relentless efficiency that suggests Mother Nature might be working for the Wehrmacht. Staying warm becomes a continuous engineering problem that requires creativity, resourcefulness, and occasionally theft on a scale that would impress professional criminals. Your current winter wardrobe consists of layers acquired through various means: Italian army surplus liberated during the September chaos, civilian clothes donated by sympathetic families, German equipment obtained through successful ambushes, and improvised insulation made from whatever materials you can find. The result looks like a clothing museum exploded, but it keeps your core temperature above fatal levels most of the time. Food preservation in sub-zero temperatures creates its own set of challenges and opportunities. On the positive side, anything you manage to acquire stays fresh indefinitely in what amounts to nature's largest refrigerator. On the negative side, eating frozen bread feels like chewing chunks of ice, flavored cardboard, and heating meals requires fires that might attract unwanted attention from German reconnaissance flights. You've learned to appreciate the culinary experience of lukewarm soup eaten quickly before it becomes lukewarm ice. The tactical situation during winter months shifts dramatically as both partisan and German operations adapt to weather conditions that make conventional military activities nearly impossible. German patrols become less frequent but more predictable, following valley roads and established paths rather than attempting cross-country movement through deep snow. This creates opportunities for well-planned ambushes, but it also means that escape routes become limited to the same paths that everyone else is using. Roberto's mountain expertise proves invaluable as he teaches your group survival skills that weren't covered in British commando training. You learn to recognize the signs of hypothermia in yourself and others, how to build emergency shelters using snow and available materials, and most importantly, how to move through deep snow without leaving obvious tracks that German patrols could follow back to your hideouts. These lessons often involve practical demonstrations where mistakes result in immediate discomfort rather than theoretical consequences. Weapons maintenance in extreme cold requires constant attention because metal components that function perfectly at normal temperatures become unreliable when exposed to freezing conditions for extended periods. Your Sten gun, never particularly trustworthy under ideal circumstances, becomes positively temperamental when ice crystals form in the firing mechanism. Oil lubricants thicken to the consistency of honey, ammunition becomes brittle, and metal surfaces become so cold that touching them with bare skin results in immediate frostbite. The psychological challenges of winter warfare prove almost as difficult as the physical demands. Shortened daylight hours compress operational time into brief windows, when visibility and temperature allow meaningful activity. The rest of each day is spent huddled in shelters, conserving body heat and trying to maintain morale, while listening to wind that sounds like it is personally angry at everyone in your cave. Conversations become shorter and more focused on practical concerns. Who is on watch next? Whether the food supplies will last until spring, and whether that cough Giuseppe developed is something serious, or just the normal result of breathing Arctic air for 3 months. Medical emergencies during winter become exponentially more dangerous, because evacuation to proper treatment facilities is often impossible due to weather conditions and German patrol activity. Elena, your group's medic, has developed protocols for treating injuries and illnesses using whatever supplies are available in mountain caves during blizzards. Her medical kit now includes items specifically chosen for cold weather treatment, additional bandages for frostbite injuries, stimulants for hypothermia cases, and pain medication for the various ailments that develop when people live in conditions that would challenge Siberian prisoners. Communication with other partisan groups and allied contacts becomes sporadic during severe weather, creating a sense of isolation that affects group morale in ways that weren't anticipated. The radio operators maintain scheduled contact when conditions permit, but atmospheric disturbances and equipment failures caused by extreme cold often result in days or weeks without outside contact. During these periods, your small group becomes your entire world, which intensifies both camaraderie and interpersonal tensions. German countermeasures during winter focus on controlling population centers and main transportation routes, while essentially conceding the high mountain regions to partisan groups, until spring weather permits more aggressive operations. This creates a tactical stalemate where both sides concentrate on survival and preparation for renewed conflict. When conditions improve, German forces retreat to heated barracks and fortified positions, while partisans endure in mountain hideouts, each side waiting for weather that will allow more active operations. Supply operations become increasingly critical and increasingly dangerous as winter progresses. Allied airdrops are limited by weather conditions that make accurate navigation and safe parachute deployment nearly impossible. Local civilian support continues, but becomes more difficult to coordinate when travel between villages requires crossing terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers. The result is that partisan groups become largely self-sufficient during the worst weather, living off stored supplies and whatever they can scavenge locally. Historians still debate whether winter conditions favored partisan operations or German security forces. But from your perspective, winter is an equal opportunity enemy that makes life miserable for everyone involved. The difference is that German soldiers can retreat to heated bunkers when conditions become unbearable, while partisans develop the kind of stubborn endurance that comes from having no alternative except death. Your first Allied supply drop feels like Christmas morning. If Christmas involved parachutes falling from the sky carrying deadly presents while German search planes circle overhead, looking for the party, the operation begins at 2 a.m. on a moonless night in February, when the drone of approaching Allied aircraft cuts through the mountain silence like a mechanical angel announcing salvation, or at least announcing better weapons and actual food that doesn't taste like pine needles and optimism. The designated drop zone is a small alpine meadow that looks deceptively peaceful during daylight, but transforms into a nerve-wracking theater of operations when you are crouched in the tree line listening for the specific engine pattern that indicates friendly aircraft, rather than German reconnaissance flights. Roberto has spent weeks preparing the site, clearing obstacles that might damage parachuted supplies, and establishing signal positions that will guide the aircraft to the correct location without advertising your presence to every enemy patrol within 50 kilometers. The signal system requires precise timing and steady nerves, because the margin for error approaches zero when you are dealing with aircraft navigation over mountainous terrain in complete darkness. Franco, your radio operator, maintains contact with the incoming plane using coded transmissions that sound like innocuous weather reports, but actually contain detailed landing instructions. Meanwhile, Giuseppe and Marco position themselves with signal lights that will mark the drop zone boundaries for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to guide the aircraft, short enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention from German forces. When the aircraft finally appears overhead, it is a British Halifax bomber that has been modified for supply operations, flying at an altitude that keeps it above small arms fire, but low enough for accurate supply deployment. The pilot must navigate by dead reckoning and radio signals, dropping supplies into a target area, roughly the size of a football field, while maintaining enough speed to escape if German fighters appear. It is precision flying that would be impressive under ideal conditions and borders on miraculous given the circumstances. The actual supply drop happens with surprising speed. 6 parachutes deploy in quick succession, carrying containers that thump into the meadow snow with impacts that sound loud enough to wake every German soldier in northern Italy. Your team immediately springs into action, racing to collect the containers before anyone with hostile intentions decides to investigate the interesting noises coming from the mountains. Each container weighs approximately 50 kilograms and contains carefully selected supplies that someone in London has determined will be most useful for Alpine resistance operations. Container number 1 reveals weapons that make your current armament look like toys from a particularly violent children's store. There are additional Sten guns with sufficient ammunition to make them actually useful, several American Thompson submachine guns that inspire immediate respect, and grenades that come with instruction manuals written in multiple languages. The British have also included specialized mountaineering equipment, climbing ropes, pitons, and cold weather gear that suggests someone in Allied intelligence actually understands the challenges of conducting guerrilla warfare at high altitude. Container number 2 contains medical supplies that Elena examines with the enthusiasm of a child discovering a candy store. If candy stores specialized in morphine, antibiotics, and surgical instruments, there are bandages, antiseptics, and pain medications that represent luxury items in the Partisan supply economy. Most importantly, there are sulfur drugs and other antibiotics that can mean the difference between recovering from infected wounds and dying slowly in a mountain cave while your comrades watch helplessly. The food supplies in container number 3 demonstrate that whoever planned this operation has a realistic understanding of partisan nutritional requirements. Instead of fancy military rations, the containers hold concentrated foods that provide maximum nutritional value with minimum weight and bulk: chocolate, canned meat, dried fruits, and coffee that tastes like civilization after months of pine needle tea. There is also a selection of Italian foods, pasta, olive oil, and preserved tomatoes that represent psychological comfort as much as physical sustenance. Container number 4 contains communication equipment that transforms your group's intelligence capabilities from amateur to professional level. There is an upgraded radio transmitter with better range and reception, along with spare parts and replacement components that address the reliability problems that have plagued your current equipment. The British have also included cryptographic materials, code books, one-time pads, and encryption devices that will make your communications considerably more secure. The remaining containers hold what can only be described as the tools of professional sabotage: plastic explosives in quantities that could redecorate significant portions of the German transportation network, timing devices that allow for delayed detonations, and specialized equipment for cutting railway lines, demolishing bridges, and generally making life complicated for occupying forces. Williams would be proud of the selection, which represents a graduate-level curriculum in applied destruction. Moving the supplies from the drop zone to secure storage locations requires careful planning and considerable physical effort, because hauling 50-kilogram containers up mountain paths in darkness while avoiding German patrols represents the kind of logistics challenge that would test professional movers under ideal conditions. Your group divides the supplies into smaller loads that can be carried by individual team members, caching different categories of materials in separate locations to minimize losses if any single storage site is discovered. The psychological impact of the supply drop extends far beyond the practical value of the materials received. The operation demonstrates that Allied command considers your resistance activities sufficiently important to risk aircraft and crews on supply missions, which provides morale benefits that are difficult to quantify but easy to recognize. When you are living in caves and eating whatever you can forage, concrete evidence that the outside world remembers and supports your efforts makes an enormous difference in maintaining the will to continue fighting. Security concerns following supply drops require heightened vigilance for several days afterward, because German intelligence has become increasingly sophisticated about detecting and responding to partisan resupply operations. The enemy uses direction, finding equipment to track radio transmissions, aerial reconnaissance to identify possible drop zones, and ground patrols to investigate reports of unusual aircraft activity. Your group must balance the need to retrieve and distribute supplies with the requirement to avoid revealing your positions to German countermeasures. Historians still debate the overall effectiveness of Allied supply operations to Italian partisans. But from your perspective, the question seems academic. The difference between having adequate supplies and making do with whatever you can improvise often determines whether resistance operations succeed or fail catastrophically. These night-time supply drops represent the lifeline that keeps your group operational and transforms you from desperate fugitives into an effective military unit. Your education in the art of making German soldiers' lives thoroughly miserable begins with what should be a textbook ambush operation. 12 partisans, one isolated German supply convoy, and a mountain road with no convenient escape routes. The plan looks elegant on paper. Wait for the convoy to enter the narrow valley section. Disable the lead and rear vehicles with explosives. Then eliminate the survivors with concentrated small arms fire. In practice, it becomes a masterclass in how warfare rarely goes according to plan. Even when your plan is relatively simple and involves significantly outnumbering the enemy. The target convoy consists of 3 trucks carrying supplies to a German garrison further up the valley, escorted by a single armored car that looks like it was designed by someone who read too many adventure novels about invincible military vehicles. Intelligence from civilian spotters indicates approximately 20 German soldiers total, which should give your group favorable odds, assuming the intelligence is accurate, and assuming that German soldiers cooperate by behaving predictably when people start shooting at them from concealed positions. Roberto has selected the ambush site with the eye of someone who understands how geography can be weaponized. The road curves around a steep hillside that provides excellent concealment for your positions, while limiting the convoy's options for evasive maneuvers. The killing zone extends for roughly 100 meters, long enough to trap the entire convoy, but short enough that your small force can concentrate effective fire across the entire target area. Escape routes have been planned and rehearsed, because successful ambushes depend as much on getting away afterward as on the actual shooting. The waiting period before the convoy arrives tests your nerves in ways that training couldn't replicate. You are lying in position for 3 hours, motionless among the rocks and snow, while your body temperature drops and your muscles stiffen from extended immobility. Every sound, wind through the trees, distant aircraft engines, the crack of settling snow, might indicate either the approaching target or incoming German patrols looking for exactly the kind of trouble you are planning to cause. When the convoy finally rounds the bend, the first thing you notice is that the intelligence was wrong in ways that matter significantly for your life expectancy. Instead of 3 trucks, there are 4, and instead of 1 armored car, there are 2, one leading and one trailing the convoy. The additional vehicles mean more enemy soldiers, more firepower, and more complications for an operation that was already going to require everything going exactly right to avoid turning into a catastrophe. The ambush begins exactly as planned when the lead vehicle hits Roberto's carefully placed explosive charge, which transforms the front armored car into modern art and blocks the road with debris that ensures the rest of the convoy can't simply drive through the killing zone. The rear explosive detonates on schedule, eliminating the trailing armored car and trapping the supply trucks in the middle of a 100-meter stretch of road that has suddenly become the most dangerous real estate in northern Italy. Your assigned position overlooks the center of the killing zone, where Giuseppe and Marco are supposed to concentrate fire on any Germans who attempt to organize defensive positions. The Sten gun performs better than expected, delivering steady automatic fire that keeps enemy soldiers pinned behind their vehicles, while other members of your team maneuver for better firing angles. The sound of concentrated small arms fire echoes off the valley walls, with an intensity that suggests the entire German army might be under attack. The German response demonstrates training and discipline that makes this considerably more challenging than shooting at stationary targets during practice sessions. Enemy soldiers immediately seek cover behind their vehicles and begin returning organized fire that forces you to keep your head down while trying to maintain effective aim. Several Germans attempt to establish a machine gun position that could dominate your firing positions, leading to a brief but intense exchange of gunfire that resolves when one of Teresa's grenades lands uncomfortably close to their improvised fortress. The entire engagement lasts approximately 8 minutes, which feels like several hours when measured in heartbeats, and the number of times bullets pass close enough to your position to encourage philosophical reflection on mortality. When the shooting finally stops, the road contains 4 destroyed vehicles, approximately 15 dead German soldiers, and enough scattered military supplies to keep your group well equipped for several weeks. More importantly, it contains 0 living German soldiers capable of reporting your positions to headquarters. Collecting useful supplies from the ambush site requires working quickly, while remaining alert for German reaction forces that might respond to the sounds of combat or investigate. When the convoy fails to reach its destination on schedule, your team salvages weapons, ammunition, food supplies, and military equipment, while avoiding booby traps that some dying German soldier might have set as a final gesture of spite. The captured supplies include German small arms that complement your British weapons, medical supplies that Elena appropriates immediately, and enough food to supplement your diet with items that don't require foraging or begging from local farmers. The withdrawal from the ambush site follows pre-planned routes that take you across terrain, where pursuing German forces would have difficulty following. Assuming they arrive quickly enough to attempt pursuit, your group divides into smaller teams that take different paths back to the mountain hideouts, making it more difficult for enemy forces to track your movement or predict your base locations. The discipline required to resist celebrating your success until you are safely away from the immediate area represents another lesson in the difference between successful operations and fatal mistakes. Intelligence gathered from captured documents reveals information about German supply schedules, garrison strengths, and planned counterinsurgency operations that proves more valuable than the material supplies obtained during the ambush. Letters found on dead German soldiers provide insights into enemy morale, which appears to be declining as the war continues and resistance activities increase. Most importantly, maps and orders indicate that German forces are planning a major sweep operation designed to eliminate partisan groups throughout your operational area. Historians still debate whether ambush tactics were the most effective form of partisan warfare or simply the most dramatic. But from your perspective, effectiveness is measured by simpler criteria. Did you inflict significant damage on enemy forces? Did you obtain useful supplies? And did your team survive to fight again? The answer to all 3 questions is yes, which makes this operation a success regardless of whatever academic debates might develop years later. The psychological impact of successful ambushes extends beyond immediate tactical results to affect both partisan morale and German confidence in their ability to control occupied territory. When enemy forces realize they can't travel mountain roads without risking attack, they begin modifying their behavior in ways that limit their operational effectiveness and demonstrate that the resistance remains a serious threat, despite occupying forces' attempts at suppression. Your introduction to the dark art of betrayal comes when Carlo, the former army sergeant who has been teaching weapons training for 6 months, disappears during a routine supply run and reappears 3 days later leading a German patrol directly to your secondary cache site. The realization that someone you've shared meals with, fought alongside, and trusted with your life has been feeding information to the enemy hits like a physical blow that makes getting shot seem like a minor inconvenience by comparison. The discovery unfolds with the kind of horrible clarity that makes you question every conversation you've had and every piece of information you've shared over the past months. When the German patrol arrives at the supply cache with suspicious precision, walking directly to a location that should be impossible to find without inside knowledge, Roberto immediately recognizes that someone has provided detailed intelligence about Partisan operations. The cache contained enough weapons and explosives to supply multiple resistance cells, but more importantly, it contained documents that could compromise the entire regional network. Carlo's betrayal becomes undeniable when German soldiers demonstrate familiarity with your group's standard operating procedures, communication codes, and planned escape routes. They've positioned blocking forces exactly where you would expect to retreat, and they're using Italian language calls that replicate your recognition signals with accuracy. That suggests extensive coaching from someone intimately familiar with your security protocols. The realization that this tactical knowledge came from within your own group creates a psychological shock that temporarily overwhelms tactical thinking. The immediate response requires abandoning established procedures and improvising new security measures while operating under the assumption that everything Carlo knew has been compromised. Your group splits into smaller teams, changes communication codes, and relocates to backup hideouts that weren't shared with the entire unit. The paranoia that follows affects every interaction, because if Carlo could betray you after months of apparent loyalty, anyone else might be feeding information to German intelligence services. Investigating how long Carlo's betrayal has been ongoing becomes a priority that requires reviewing recent operations for signs of enemy foreknowledge that might have been overlooked at the time. Giuseppe recalls that German patrols seemed unusually well informed about partisan movements during several recent encounters, and Elena remembers that medical supplies went missing from supposedly secure locations. The pattern suggests that Carlo's collaboration with German forces might have been ongoing for weeks or even months before his disappearance. The motivations behind Carlo's betrayal remain unclear, but the possibilities range from ideological conversion to simple coercion involving threats against family members. German counterintelligence operations have become increasingly sophisticated about identifying leverage points that can turn resistance fighters into informants, using everything from financial pressure to captured relatives as inducements for cooperation. Understanding why Carlo betrayed you matters less than adapting to the operational reality that your security has been compromised. Intelligence measures become an immediate priority that transforms your group's internal culture from one based on trust to one based on careful verification of all information and activities. New protocols require that sensitive information be compartmentalized so that no single individual possesses enough knowledge to compromise the entire operation. Communication procedures are changed weekly. Supply cache locations are known only to specific individuals, and operational planning involves multiple backup plans that account for possible security breaches. The psychological impact of discovering betrayal within your group affects everyone differently, but the common result is an increase in vigilance that borders on paranoia. Marco becomes obsessive about checking and rechecking security procedures, while Giuseppe withdraws into himself and begins questioning everyone's motivations for seemingly innocent comments. The camaraderie that developed through shared hardship remains, but it is now overlaid with wariness that affects every conversation and decision. Dealing with captured documents that Carlo might have compromised requires immediate action to warn other partisan groups and civilian supporters who could be at risk. Franco works overtime on radio communications, sending coded warnings to resistance cells throughout the region about possible security breaches and advising changes to planned operations that Carlo knew about. The ripple effects of a single betrayal spread through the entire resistance network like contamination from a disease. German exploitation of Carlo's information becomes apparent through increased patrol activity in areas that were previously considered safe, and through arrests of civilians who had been providing support to partisan operations. Anna, the innkeeper who served as an intelligence source, disappears one night and is later found to have been taken to German headquarters for interrogation. The knowledge that your trusted colleague's betrayal has resulted in civilians being tortured creates a moral burden that affects the entire group's psychological state. Developing new recruitment and vetting procedures becomes essential for preventing future security breaches. But the challenge is maintaining operational effectiveness while implementing security measures that might exclude genuine volunteers. Roberto establishes protocols requiring multiple references from known partisans, extended observation periods for new recruits, and gradual introduction to sensitive information based on demonstrated reliability over time. These measures reduce the risk of infiltration, but also slow the process of expanding resistance operations. The hunt for Carlo himself becomes a secondary priority compared to damage control. But the desire for revenge motivates several group members to advocate for tracking him down and eliminating the threat he represents to ongoing operations. Elena argues that resources should focus on protecting current operations rather than pursuing personal vendettas, while Marco insists that allowing betrayal to go unpunished will encourage other potential collaborators. The debate reveals how betrayal affects group cohesion and decision-making processes. Intelligence gathering about German counterintelligence operations becomes crucial for understanding how Carlo was recruited and what methods enemy forces are using to identify and turn resistance fighters. Information obtained from subsequent operations suggests that German services are offering substantial rewards for information about partisan activities, while also using increasingly sophisticated psychological pressure techniques to create informants from captured resistance members. Historians still debate whether betrayal was a significant factor in the effectiveness of Italian partisan operations, or merely an inevitable consequence of underground warfare. But from your daily experience, the impact of treachery extends far beyond simple operational security concerns. Trust becomes a luxury that must be carefully rationed, and every new face represents a potential threat that requires constant evaluation. The war against fascist occupation continues, but now it includes a parallel war against the possibility that your closest comrades might be your deadliest enemies. Your calendar shows the 15th of April 1945, but you are marking time by a different metric: the increasing frequency of German retreats, the growing boldness of partisan operations, and the unmistakable sound of Allied artillery getting closer each day. The war that seemed like it might last forever is suddenly showing signs of actually ending, and your role is shifting from desperate survival to coordinated liberation operations that require entirely different tactical thinking and considerably more optimism than you've allowed yourself to feel in 18 months. The strategic situation has transformed dramatically since the beginning of the year, with German forces throughout northern Italy beginning what military historians will politely call strategic withdrawals, but which look suspiciously like increasingly panicked retreats to anyone watching from mountain hideouts. Allied forces are advancing up the Italian peninsula with momentum that suggests the Wehrmacht's defensive capabilities have degraded significantly, while partisan groups throughout the region are receiving orders to coordinate with regular military operations rather than simply conducting independent harassment campaigns. Your group's mission parameters have evolved from basic survival and occasional sabotage to participating in the systematic liberation of major population centers throughout the Alpine region. Instead of hiding in caves and conducting hit-and-run attacks, you are now coordinating with Allied military intelligence to secure strategic objectives, protect civilian populations during the transition period, and prevent German forces from implementing scorched earth tactics that would devastate local infrastructure. The first major liberation operation targets the town of Borgosija, a regional transportation hub that controls access to several Alpine valleys. German forces have been using the town as a supply depot and communication center, but intelligence reports suggest their garrison has been reduced to maintain stronger positions elsewhere. Your role involves securing the railway station and preventing the destruction of the bridge that carries the main road across the river, objectives that require holding territory rather than simply attacking and withdrawing. Planning for urban operations requires skills that weren't covered in your mountain warfare education because fighting in built-up areas involves different tactical considerations than ambushing convoys on isolated roads. Buildings provide cover but also create blind spots where enemy forces might establish defensive positions. Civilian populations become both an asset, local knowledge and support, and a liability since combat operations must minimize harm to non-combatants who have already endured years of occupation hardship. The approach to Borgosesia reveals the extent to which German resistance has weakened over recent weeks. What should have been a heavily defended position is instead protected by a skeleton force that appears more interested in avoiding combat than inflicting casualties on attacking partisans. Reconnaissance conducted by Teresa and Marco indicates that most German personnel are preparing for evacuation rather than organizing last-ditch defensive operations, suggesting that their orders emphasize preservation of forces over holding territory. The actual assault on the town proceeds with surprising smoothness, partly due to careful planning, and partly because German morale has degraded to the point where many enemy soldiers seem relieved to have an excuse to surrender, rather than continuing a war that everyone recognizes as lost. Your group approaches the railway station expecting fierce resistance, but instead encounters German soldiers who fire a few token rounds before indicating their willingness to discuss surrender terms. Securing the railway station involves more paperwork than gunfire. Civilian officers formally surrender their positions while providing detailed information about remaining defensive preparations and the locations of any booby traps that might threaten civilians. The professional courtesy displayed during these surrender negotiations stands in stark contrast to the bitter combat that characterized earlier stages of the war, suggesting that both sides recognize the conflict's approaching conclusion. The bridge operation proves more challenging, not because of German resistance, but because enemy engineers have prepared demolition charges that could destroy the structure if triggered by retreating forces. Elena and Giuseppe work with captured German personnel to identify and disarm explosive devices that have been placed with the kind of thoroughness that suggests someone really wanted to make sure this bridge wouldn't survive German withdrawal. Dismantling these charges requires technical expertise that combines your British training with German engineering knowledge provided by cooperative prisoners. Civilian reaction to liberation reveals the complex emotions that develop during extended occupation periods. The initial joy and celebration are genuine but mixed with wariness about whether partisan control represents genuine liberation or simply a temporary reprieve before German forces return with reinforcements. Local residents approach your group with combinations of gratitude, relief, and caution that reflect their understanding that military situations can change rapidly and that premature celebrations might prove dangerous. Establishing temporary civil administration in liberated areas requires organizational skills that weren't part of your partisan training. Because maintaining public order and essential services involves different challenges than conducting guerrilla warfare, your group must coordinate with local civilian leaders to restore basic functions, water supply, food distribution, medical services, while maintaining security against possible German counterattacks or sabotage operations conducted by remaining enemy agents. Communication with Allied military headquarters becomes a priority for coordinating partisan liberation operations with broader strategic objectives. Franco establishes regular radio contact with Allied command posts, providing detailed reports about German troop movements, civilian conditions, and infrastructure status in newly liberated areas. These communications transform your group from independent resistance fighters into auxiliary forces, supporting conventional military operations. The psychological transition from resistance to liberation proves surprisingly difficult, because skills developed for survival under occupation don't necessarily translate directly to maintaining order during political transitions. Roberto struggles with the shift from making survival-based decisions to considering long-term implications of administrative choices while Marco finds it difficult to trust that German withdrawal represents permanent change rather than temporary tactical repositioning. Processing captured German equipment and documents provides intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions that helps Allied forces plan subsequent operations. Captured maps reveal German defensive positions throughout the region, while personal papers from German personnel provide insights into morale conditions and unit effectiveness. This intelligence proves valuable for predicting German behavior during continued Allied advances. Historians still debate whether partisan forces made decisive contributions to the final liberation campaigns, or simply participated in operations that conventional Allied forces would have completed independently. But from your perspective, the question seems less important than the reality that your 18 months of mountain warfare have contributed to the restoration of Italian sovereignty and the defeat of fascist occupation forces. Your first encounter with Allied Special Forces occurs when Captain James Henderson of the British Special Operations Executive drops into your mountain camp with the casual aplomb of someone arriving for afternoon tea. Except he is carrying enough specialized equipment to outfit a small army and speaking Italian with an accent that suggests he learned the language from someone who learned it from a textbook. Henderson represents a new phase in partisan operations. Direct coordination with Allied military intelligence for targeted missions that require local knowledge combined with professional military expertise. The integration of Allied special forces with partisan groups creates opportunities for operations that neither organization could accomplish independently. Henderson brings technical expertise in advanced demolition techniques, sophisticated communication equipment, and detailed intelligence about German military installations, gathered through aerial reconnaissance and intercepted communications. Your group contributes intimate knowledge of local terrain, established networks of civilian support, and the kind of tactical flexibility that comes from 18 months of successful survival behind enemy lines. The first joint operation targets a German communication facility that coordinates enemy responses throughout the entire Alpine region. The installation is located in a heavily fortified position that would be impossible for partisan forces to assault directly, but could be vulnerable to infiltration by personnel familiar with local conditions and escape routes. Henderson's role involves providing specialized equipment and technical expertise, while your group handles reconnaissance, route planning, and the actual penetration of enemy security perimeters. Training with Allied Special Forces reveals the extent to which your group has developed skills that complement but differ significantly from conventional military capabilities. Henderson demonstrates advanced techniques for silent movement, lockpicking, and sabotage that exceed anything covered in your original British training. But he also expresses genuine respect for the mountain warfare expertise and improvisational abilities that your group has developed through necessity and experience. The communication facility operation requires infiltrating a German installation without alerting security personnel, accessing sensitive equipment located in protected areas, and destroying communication capabilities while avoiding detection long enough to escape before enemy reaction forces can respond. Success depends on precise timing, detailed preparation, and the kind of coordination that develops between military professionals who trust each other's competence completely. Roberto's reconnaissance of the target facility reveals security measures that would challenge even experienced special operations personnel. Multiple guard posts, electronic detection equipment, and physical barriers, designed to prevent exactly the kind of infiltration your joint team is planning. The German security arrangement suggests that enemy forces consider this communication center sufficiently important to warrant protection measures that exceed those used for routine military installations. Henderson's technical analysis of the facility identifies vulnerabilities that can be exploited using specialized equipment and tactics that weren't available to partisan operations previously. The communication equipment uses technology that can be disabled more effectively through targeted sabotage than through conventional explosive attacks, which means the mission requires precision rather than firepower and technical expertise. Rather than brute force, the actual infiltration proceeds according to plan until it doesn't. which is when you discover that military operations seldom unfold exactly as anticipated, regardless of how carefully they're planned or how professionally they're executed. German security procedures prove more sophisticated than reconnaissance suggested, requiring improvisational modifications to established plans that test everyone's ability to adapt tactical approaches while maintaining mission objectives under unexpected pressure. Giuseppe demonstrates the value of partisan experience. Giuseppelative approach routes that don't appear on any map, but provide access to the facility through terrain that German security planners apparently didn't consider adequately. His knowledge of local geography, combined with Henderson's technical expertise, creates tactical opportunities that neither partisan nor Allied forces could have developed independently through conventional military planning. The sabotage operation itself requires skills that combine Henderson's specialized training with practical techniques that your group has developed through 18 months of making German equipment stop working properly. Elena's medical training proves unexpectedly relevant when disabling communication equipment requires understanding how electronic systems function similarly to biological systems, while Marco's mechanical aptitude translates directly to identifying critical components that will render complex equipment inoperative when damaged precisely. Escape from the facility after completing the sabotage mission demonstrates the advantages of operating in territory where partisan forces have established extensive support networks and detailed knowledge of terrain features that favor evasion over pursuit. German reaction forces respond quickly and professionally, but their search operations are hampered by unfamiliarity with local conditions and limited cooperation from civilian populations who have learned to provide misdirection rather than assistance to enemy personnel. The success of the communication facility operation leads to additional joint missions that gradually increase in complexity and importance as Allied command recognizes the effectiveness of combining special forces capabilities with partisan local knowledge and civilian support networks. These operations target German supply depots, transportation infrastructure, and military installations that require approaches beyond the capabilities of either conventional Allied forces or independent partisan groups. Henderson's integration with your group reveals the mutual respect that develops between professional military personnel and resistance fighters who have survived extended combat operations under extremely challenging conditions. His initial skepticism about partisan military capabilities gradually transforms into recognition that your group possesses tactical skills and operational experience that complement rather than duplicate conventional special forces training. Intelligence sharing between Allied special forces and partisan organizations provides both groups with information that enhances operational effectiveness significantly. Henderson's access to intercepted German communications and aerial reconnaissance data helps your group understand enemy capabilities and intentions with greater accuracy than was possible through local observation alone. While partisan intelligence about German personnel procedures and local conditions helps Allied forces plan operations with better understanding of actual theoretical situations. Henderson's presence demonstrates concrete Allied commitment to Italian resistance operations and provides evidence that partisan contributions are recognized and valued by professional military organizations. This recognition validates the sacrifices that resistance fighters have made and reinforces the conviction that their efforts contribute meaningfully to eventual Allied victory. Historians still debate whether Allied special forces operations in occupied Italy were primarily dependent on partisan support or merely benefited from local assistance that enhanced but didn't determine mission success. But from your daily experience, the distinction seems academic. The joint operations demonstrate that resistance warfare achieves maximum effectiveness when local knowledge and established support networks combine with professional military expertise and specialized equipment to create tactical capabilities that exceed what either organization can accomplish independently. Your understanding of war's true cost crystallizes the morning you find Marco's body in the ravine below the mountain pass, his frozen hand still clutching the message he was carrying to coordinate what should have been a routine supply exchange with another partisan cell. He's been dead for at least 12 hours, killed by a German patrol that somehow anticipated his route and set up an ambush in terrain that everyone assumed was safe for movement. Marco was 23 years old, had survived 18 months of mountain warfare, and died 3 weeks before Germany's unconditional surrender. Because war doesn't care about timing or fairness, or the ironic tragedy of surviving until almost the end. The discovery forces a reckoning with losses that your group has been accumulating gradually over the past year and a half. Casualties that somehow seemed manageable when they occurred individually, but now reveal themselves as a devastating erosion of the people who began this journey together. Giuseppe died during the winter from infected wounds that couldn't heal properly in cave conditions. Teresa was captured during a courier mission and never returned, her fate unknown, but easily imagined. Carlo's betrayal cost not only trust but lives, because his information led German forces to 3 other partisan groups that were eliminated before they could relocate to secure positions. The psychological mechanism that allows soldiers to continue fighting while friends die around them involves a form of emotional compartmentalization that lets you acknowledge loss without being paralyzed by grief. But that mechanism has limits that become apparent when cumulative casualties reach a certain threshold. You've attended too many hasty burials in mountain soil, said too many abbreviated farewells to people who went on routine missions and never returned, and watched too many strong men break down when the weight of accumulated sorrow finally exceeded their capacity to carry it. Elena has changed most visibly under the pressure of serving as the group's primary medical officer during 18 months of combat operations. She has saved lives that would have been lost without her skills, but she has also watched people die from wounds that proper medical facilities could have treated successfully. The combination of professional satisfaction and personal anguish has created a form of emotional exhaustion that shows in her increasingly methodical approach to treatment decisions and her tendency to withdraw from social interactions that don't serve immediate tactical purposes. Roberto carries responsibility not only for his own survival, but for tactical decisions that have determined whether other people lived or died, and that burden has aged him in ways that extend beyond the physical demands of mountain warfare. His natural leadership abilities made him the logical choice for making life and death decisions. But 18 months of choosing who goes on dangerous missions and who stays in relative safety has created psychological weight that affects his sleep, his appetite, and his ability to find humor in situations that once would have provoked his characteristic dry commentary. The civilian casualties connected to partisan operations create a different category of moral burden, because resistance activities inevitably expose sympathetic civilians to German retaliation that can be brutal beyond any reasonable proportion to the assistance provided. Anna the innkeeper was tortured for information about partisan communications before being shot, and her death weighs on everyone who benefited from her intelligence gathering. The knowledge that civilian supporters faced greater risks than the partisans they assisted creates guilt that survives long after tactical justifications for accepting their help have been forgotten. French partisan writings from the period suggest that resistance fighters throughout occupied Europe experienced similar psychological challenges. But those historical parallels provide little comfort when you are dealing with the immediate reality of friends who will never see liberation, families who will receive delayed notification that their sons died fighting for freedom, and communities that paid disproportionate prices for supporting resistance activities. The academic term collateral damage fails to capture the personal reality of specific individuals whose lives were destroyed by proximity to warfare. The survivors develop coping mechanisms that range from adaptive to destructive, depending on individual personality and the specific circumstances of each person's war experience. Franco has become obsessively focused on radio procedures, maintaining communication schedules with precision that borders on compulsion, as if perfect adherence to technical protocols might prevent future losses. Giuseppe retreats into increasingly elaborate hunting and foraging activities that provide essential supplies, but also offer escape from human interactions that remind him of absent friends. Medical records from Allied liberation forces document high rates of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress among partisan veterans. But the immediate concern is maintaining operational effectiveness during the war's final weeks. Henderson notices behavioral changes that affect tactical decision-making and group cohesion, leading to discussions about rotating personnel away from combat operations and providing whatever psychological support is available in mountain hideouts with limited resources and uncertain futures. The proximity of victory creates additional psychological complexity, because losses that seemed acceptable when survival was uncertain become tragic when success appears guaranteed. Deaths that could be justified during desperate resistance now seem senseless when German defeat is clearly imminent, creating retrospective anguish about tactical decisions that might have been made differently if the war's duration had been known precisely. The knowledge that some friends died unnecessarily adds guilt to grief and anger to sorrow. Memory becomes both comfort and torment as surviving partisans process 18 months of shared experiences that include both camaraderie and trauma in proportions that defy easy categorization. The stories that will be told after the war ends will necessarily simplify complex experiences into narratives that emphasize heroism and sacrifice, while potentially overlooking the more mundane realities of fear, exhaustion, and moral ambiguity that characterized daily life during extended combat operations. The philosophical questions raised by resistance warfare, whether violence in service of liberation justifies the costs imposed on participants and civilians, remain unresolved even as military victory becomes certain. Academic discussions about the ethics of guerrilla warfare might develop different conclusions than those reached by people who experience the daily reality of choosing between action and submission, resistance and safety, individual survival, and collective freedom. Historians will debate whether the psychological costs of partisan warfare were justified by the strategic benefits achieved through resistance operations. But from your current perspective, such calculations seem both necessary and inadequate. The price of freedom has been measured in friends who won't see liberation, civilians who died supporting resistance, and psychological wounds that may never heal completely. Whether that price was worth paying remains a question that each survivor must answer individually, and those answers may change over time as memory processes trauma and peace provides perspective on wartime choices. Your war officially ends on May 2nd, 1945, when German forces in Italy surrender unconditionally. But the transition from partisan fighter to civilian feels more complicated than simply hanging up your weapons and walking back down the mountain to resume whatever passes for normal life. After 18 months of guerrilla warfare, the skills that kept you alive, constant vigilance, automatic suspicion of strangers, the ability to sleep with one ear listening for approaching danger, don't simply disappear because politicians have signed surrender documents and newspapers are declaring victory. The immediate aftermath of German surrender creates practical challenges that nobody anticipated during the long months, when liberation seemed like a distant goal rather than an administrative problem requiring immediate solutions. Your group possesses an impressive arsenal of weapons that were essential for resistance operations, but now represent a potential security hazard in communities trying to establish peaceful civilian governance. The question of what to do with captured German equipment, improvised explosives, and military supplies becomes surprisingly complex when there is no longer an obvious enemy to use them against. Roberto assumes responsibility for coordinating the demobilization process, working with Allied military authorities to inventory weapons and ensure their secure disposal or transfer to appropriate governmental agencies. The bureaucratic procedures required for officially ending your unofficial military service involve paperwork that seems almost surreal. After 18 months of operations where written records were security risks that could get everyone killed if discovered by German patrols, Elena faces different challenges as she attempts to transition medical skills developed under extreme conditions to peacetime applications where proper facilities, adequate supplies, and professional oversight are available. Her experience treating gunshot wounds, performing surgery with improvised instruments, and making triage decisions under enemy fire represents valuable medical training, but it is not the kind of education that easily translates to civilian medical credentials or standard hospital procedures. The process of returning to your hometown reveals the extent to which both you and the community have changed during the war years. Turin shows physical damage from Allied bombing campaigns and German defensive preparations, but the psychological changes in the civilian population are less visible and more complex. People who collaborated with fascist authorities now face potential retribution from resistance sympathizers, while resistance supporters must reconcile their actions with neighbors who chose different survival strategies during the occupation. Your family's reaction to your return combines relief, pride, and a certain wariness that reflects their uncertainty about how 18 months of combat experience might have changed you. Your mother treats you like a hero and an invalid simultaneously, providing elaborate meals while watching carefully for signs of psychological trauma that she doesn't fully understand but recognizes might affect your ability to resume normal relationships and responsibilities. Finding employment proves challenging because your most recent job experience involves skills that aren't directly applicable to civilian occupations, and potential employers sometimes view partisan veterans with combinations of respect and suspicion that complicate hiring decisions. The technical skills you developed, demolitions, weapons, maintenance, field communications, might have military applications, but peacetime Italy needs workers for reconstruction projects and civilian industries that require different expertise. The political situation in post-war Italy creates additional complications as various resistance groups attempt to translate wartime cooperation into peacetime political influence. The unity that developed among partisan organizations during German occupation begins to fracture along ideological lines as communist, socialist, and liberal resistance leaders compete for political power and struggle to define what kind of government should replace the fascist regime. Giuseppe chooses to remain in the mountains, working as a guide for tourists who want to visit the areas where partisan operations were conducted, but his decision reflects difficulty adjusting to urban life rather than simple preference for mountain conditions. The survival skills that made him invaluable during resistance operations don't necessarily translate to peacetime social interactions, and he finds civilian concerns about career advancement and material prosperity difficult to take seriously after 18 months, when survival was the only goal that mattered. Marriage and family relationships require readjustment as partisan veterans attempt to form intimate personal connections after extended periods when emotional attachments were luxuries that could compromise operational security. The hypervigilance that kept you alive during resistance operations can interfere with the trust and vulnerability that healthy relationships require, and the experience of losing friends in combat affects your willingness to form new emotional bonds that might result in additional grief. Franco continues working with radio equipment, but his post-war communications involve commercial broadcasting rather than clandestine military operations, and he struggles with the transition from transmissions, where lives depended on perfect accuracy, to civilian broadcasting, where minor technical problems represent inconvenience rather than potential catastrophe. The precision that was essential for partisan radio work sometimes creates problems when applied to civilian situations that don't require the same level of meticulous attention to procedural details. The question of how to remember and commemorate resistance experiences becomes important as partisan veterans begin organizing associations and planning memorials for fallen comrades. The stories that will be preserved in official histories necessarily simplify complex experiences into narratives suitable for public consumption, and there is ongoing tension between the desire to honor sacrifice and the need to acknowledge moral ambiguities that characterized guerrilla warfare. Legal proceedings against war criminals and collaborators create opportunities for partisan veterans to testify about German atrocities and fascist crimes. But these proceedings also require reliving traumatic experiences and making public statements about events that participants might prefer to process privately. The judicial system's need for detailed testimony conflicts with veterans' desires to move forward rather than dwelling on wartime experiences. Historians studying the Italian resistance movement interview partisan veterans to gather first-hand accounts of resistance operations. But the process of converting lived experience into historical narrative raises questions about accuracy, selectivity, and the differences between individual memory and collective historical truth. Your recollections of specific events might differ significantly from those of other participants, and the passage of time affects how traumatic experiences are remembered and interpreted. The long-term psychological effects of extended combat operations become apparent gradually as partisan veterans adjust to peacetime life and develop perspective on their wartime experiences. Some veterans successfully integrate their resistance service into broader life narratives that emphasize contribution to national liberation, while others struggle with trauma symptoms that interfere with civilian relationships and occupational success. The knowledge that you participated in historically significant events provides both pride and burden, because resistance veterans carry responsibility for preserving the memory of friends who didn't survive to tell their own stories, and ensuring that the sacrifices made during German occupation continue to have meaning for future generations, who will inherit the freedom that partisan operations helped secure. Your civilian life resumes, but it is forever marked by 18 months when ordinary young men and women made extraordinary choices about courage, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. The war has ended, but its lessons about human resilience, moral complexity, and the costs of political liberty remain relevant as Italy rebuilds, and as you attempt to transform survival skills into civilian success. The morning light filters through your bedroom window in Turin, the same window you looked through 18 months ago when everything seemed simpler and the future felt predictable. Now you wake automatically at dawn, still listening for sounds that don't belong, still calculating escape routes from rooms that no one is trying to trap you in. Your mother brings you coffee, real coffee, not pine needle tea, and you sit at the kitchen table where your family discusses normal concerns about work and weather and neighborhood gossip. That seems both precious and surreal after so many months, when conversations focused on ammunition counts and German patrol schedules. The mirror shows a face that is older than its calendar years, marked by experiences that civilian life can't easily accommodate, but that have become permanent parts of who you are now. Your hands still carry scars from mountain rocks and cold metal, and you still automatically check exits whenever you enter a room. But these habits are softening gradually as peacetime routine replaces survival instinct. Sometimes when the wind comes down from the mountains, you think about the caves where you sheltered and the friends who didn't return, and you wonder if the freedom you helped secure will prove worthy of their sacrifice. The answer, you suppose, will be determined by how well the living honor the dead through the choices they make in the peace that partisan warfare helped create. The mountains remain, ancient and indifferent, holding their secrets and their memories, while new generations discover that courage and sacrifice are not qualities reserved for history books, but ordinary possibilities that emerge when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and choose to resist rather than surrender.